Hello and welcome to Educational Psychology. This is Module 4 and my name is Dr. Neil Soggie. Within this module, we will begin by talking about individual and group differences. So, just a little bit about differences. For convenience, we're going to make a major distinction between differences among individuals and differences among groups of students. Now, as the term implies, individual differences are qualities that are unique. Just one person has them at a time. Variation in hair color, for example, is an individual difference. Even though some people have nearly the same hair color, no two people are exactly the same. Group differences are qualities shared by members of an identifiable group or community, but not shared by everyone in society. An example is gender role. For better or worse, one portion of society, the males, is perceived differently and expected to behave a bit differently than another portion of society, females. Notice that distinguishing between individual and group differences is convenient, but in all honesty, it is a bit arbitrary. Individuals with similar but nonetheless unique qualities sometimes group themselves together for certain purposes, and groups usually contain a lot of individual diversity within them. If you happen to enjoy playing soccer, for example, and have some talent for it, which is an individual quality, for example, you may end up as a member of a soccer team or club, a group defined by members' common desire and ability to play soccer. But though everyone on the team fits a soccer player's profile at some level, individual members will probably vary in level of skill and level of motivation. The group, by its very nature, may obscure these signs of individuality. So to begin then, we look at several differences normally considered to be individual rather than group-based. Now, when we explore this, it's necessarily going to be incomplete and simple because individual differences are so numerous and so important in teaching that some of them will need to be left for later modules. But we are going to look at some of these individual differences. One of those is learning style. All of us, including all of our students, have preferred ways of learning. Teachers often refer to these as learning styles. And though this term may imply that students are more consistent across situations than really is the case, one student may like to make diagrams to help remember a reading assignment, whereas another student may prefer to write a sketchy outline instead. Yet, in many cases, the students could, in principle, reverse the strategies and still learn the material, if coached, or perhaps if required. The diagram maker could take notes for a change, and the note taker could draw diagrams. Both will still learn, though neither might feel as comfortable as when using the strategies that they prefer. Now, this reality suggests that a balanced, middle-of-the-road approach may be a teacher's best response to students' learning styles. Or to put it another way, it's good to support students' preferred learning strategies where possible and where appropriate. but neither necessary nor desirable to do so at all times. Now, most of all, it's neither necessary nor possible to classify or label students according to seemingly fixed learning styles, and then allow them to learn only according to those styles. A student may prefer to hear new material rather than to see it. A student may prefer for you to explain something orally, for example, rather than to see it demonstrated in a video. But the student may nonetheless tolerate or sometimes even prefer to see it demonstrated in the video. Now, in the long run, in fact, the student may learn it best by encountering the materials in both ways, regardless of their habitual preferences. Now, that said, there is evidence that individuals, including students, do differ in how they habitually think. These differences are more specific than learning styles or preferences, and some psychologists sometimes call them cognitive styles, meaning typical ways of perceiving and remembering information, and typical ways of solving problems and making decisions. In a style of thinking called field dependence, for example, individuals perceive patterns as a whole rather than focus on the parts of the pattern separately. In a complementary tendency called field independence, individuals are more inclined to analyze overall patterns into their parts. Now, cognitive research from the 40s all the way up to today have found field dependence and independence differences to be somewhat stable for any given person across situations, although not completely. Someone who is field dependent, that is, they perceive globally or holistically in one situation, tends to a modest extent to perceive things globally or holistically in other situations. Field dependence and independence can be important to understanding students because the styles affect students' behaviors and their preferences in schools and classrooms. Field-dependent persons tend to work better in groups, at least it seems, and to prefer open-ended fields of study like literature and history. Field-independent persons, on the other hand, tend to work better alone and to prefer highly analytical studies like math and science. Now, the difference are only a tendency, however. And there are a lot of students who contradict these general trends. Now, as with the broader notion of learning styles, the cognitive styles of field dependence and field independence can be useful for tailoring instruction to particular students. But their guidance is not exact. It's only approximate. They neither can nor should they be locked into a particular mode of learning, nor should they replace a student's own expressed preferences and choices about curriculum. Now, another cognitive style is impulsivity as compared to reflectivity. Now, as the names imply, an impulsive cognitive style is one in which a person reacts quickly, but as a result makes comparatively more errors. A reflective style is the opposite. The person reacts more slowly and therefore makes fewer mistakes. As you might expect, the reflective style would seem better suited to many academic demands, within a school. Now, research has found that this is indeed the case for academic skills that clearly benefit from reflection, such as mathematical problem solving or certain reading tasks. But some classroom or school-related skills may actually develop better if a student is relatively impulsive. So being a good partner in a cooperative learning group, for example, may depend partly on responding spontaneously. So being a little bit impulsive to another person's suggestions seems to make the person more flexible. And being an effective member of an athletic team may depend on not taking time to reflect carefully on every move that you or your teammates make. So there are two major ways to use knowledge of students' cognitive styles. The first and most obvious is to build on students' existing style strengths and preferences. A student who is field independent and reflective, for example, can be encouraged to explore tasks and activities that are relatively analytic and that require relatively independent work. One who is field dependent and impulsive, on the other hand, can be encouraged and supported to try tasks and activities that are more social or spontaneous. But a second, less obvious way to use knowledge of cognitive styles is to encourage more balance in cognitive styles for students who need it. A student who lacks field independence, for example, may need explicit help in organizing and analyzing key academic tasks, like organizing a lab report in a science class. One who is already highly reflective may need encouragement to try ideas spontaneously, as in a creative writing lesson, for example. So that's a little bit about cognitive styles, learning styles. Let's go on to multiple intelligences. Now, for nearly a century, educators and psychologists have debated the nature of intelligence. And more specifically, whether intelligence is just one broad ability or can take more than one form. Many classical definitions of the concept have defined intelligence as a single broad ability that allows a person to solve or complete many sorts of tasks, or at least many academic tasks like reading, knowledge, vocabulary, and the solving of logical problems. There is research evidence of such global ability, and the idea of general intelligence often fits with society's everyday beliefs about intelligence. Partly for this reason, an entire mini-industry has grown up around publishing tests of intelligence, academic ability, and academic achievement. Since these tests affect the work of teachers, I'll need to come back to these later in this course. But there are also problems with defining intelligence as one general ability. One way of summing up the problem is to say that conceiving of intelligence as something general tends to put it beyond teachers' influence. When viewed as a single all-purpose ability, students either have a lot of intelligence or they don't. And strengthening their intelligence becomes a major challenge, or perhaps even an impossible challenge. And this conclusion is troubling to some educators, especially in recent years as testing school achievements have become more common and as students have become more diverse. But alternate views of intelligence also exist that portray intelligence as having multiple forms, where the forms are subparts of a single broader ability, or are multiple intelligence in their own right. For various reasons, such perspectives have gained popularity among teachers in recent years. And this probably reflects many teachers' beliefs that students cannot be rated only on a single scale of ability, but that students are, by nature, fundamentally diverse. Now, one of the most prominent of these models is Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. Gardner proposes that there are 8 different forms of intelligence, each of which functions independently of the others. And you can see in the slide here, I've had them summarized. Each person has a mix of all 8 abilities, more of one, less of another, that helps to constitute the person's individual cognitive profile. Since most tasks, including most tasks in classrooms, require several forms of intelligence and can be completed in more than one way, it is possible for people with various profiles of talents to succeed on a task equally well. In writing an essay, for example, a student with high interpersonal intelligence but rather average verbal intelligence might use their interpersonal strength to get a lot of help and advice from classmates and the teacher. The student with the opposite profile might work well alone, but without the benefit of help from others. Both students might end up with essays that are good, but they're good for different reasons. Now, as evidence for the possibility of multiple intelligences, Gardner cites descriptions of individuals with exceptional talent in one form of intelligence, for example, in playing the piano, but who are neither above nor below average in other areas. He also cites descriptions of individuals with brain damage, some of who lose one particular form of intelligence, for example, the ability to speak, but retain other forms. In the opinion of many psychologists, the evidence of multiple intelligence is not strong enough to give up a classical view of general intelligence, but it is recognized that information processing is distributed across parts of the brain, that there's different tasks that are better wired for different parts of the brain. Now, part of the problem is that the evidence for multiple intelligences lies to a large extent in anecdotes, examples, and descriptions, rather than on more widespread information and data. Nevertheless, whatever the status of the research evidence, the model itself can be useful as a way for teachers to think about their work. Multiple intelligence suggests the importance of diversifying instruction in order to honor and to respond to diversity in students' talents and abilities. Now, viewed like this, whether Gardner's classification scheme is actually accurate is probably less important than the fact that there is, or maybe, more than one way to be smart. In the end, as with cognitive and learning styles, it may not be important to label students' intelligences or intellectual strengths. It may be more important simply to provide important learning and knowledge in several modes and different styles so that you can draw on more than one possible form of intelligence or skill. A good example of this is your own development in learning to teach. It's well and good to read books about teaching, but It is even better to read books and to talk to classmates and educators about teaching. And even better to read books, talk with classmates about teaching, review your performance with supervisors, and have actual experience in classrooms. The combination both invites and requires a wide range of talents. And usually it's going to prove more effective than any one single type of activity. Whatever your profile of cognitive styles or abilities, intellectual abilities, happens to be. So variety is important. Now, there is the opportunity of working with gifted and talented students. Now, the idea of multiple intelligences leads to new ways of thinking about students who have special gifts and talents. Traditionally, the term gifted referred only to students with unusually high verbal skills. Their skills were demonstrated especially well, for example, on standardized tests of general ability or of school achievement. More recently, however, the meaning of gifted has broadened to include unusual talents in a range of activities such as music, creative writing, or even the arts. To indicate the change, educators often use the dual term gifted and talented students. Now, contrary to common impression, students who are gifted or talented are not necessarily awkwardly social. Their social awkwardness is a stereotype, not a requirement. It's not that they are necessarily awkward socially, less healthy, or narrow in their interest. In fact, quite the contrary. They also come from all economic and cultural groups. Ironically, in spite of their obvious strengths as learners, such students often languish in school unless teachers can provide them with more than the challenges of the usual curriculum. A kindergarten child who is precociously advanced in reading, for example, may make little further progress at reading if her teacher does not recognize and develop that skill. That talent may effectively disappear from view as peers gradually catch up to that student's initial level. Without accommodation to their unusual level or skill of knowledge, students who are gifted or talented can become bored by school. And eventually the boredom can even turn into behavior problems. Partly for this reason, students who are gifted or talented have sometimes become regarded as the responsibility of special education, along with students with other sorts of disabilities. Often their needs are discussed, for example, in textbooks about special education, alongside discussions of students with intellectual disabilities, physical impairments, and major behavior disorders. There's some logic to this way of thinking about their needs. After all, they are quite exceptional, and they do require extra work, and they require modification of the usual school programs in order to reach their full potential. But that's part of the joy of teaching. But it's also misleading to ignore obvious differences between exceptionally gifted and exceptional disabilities of other kinds. The key difference is the student's potential. By definition, students with gifts or talents are capable of creative, committed work at levels that often approach talented adults. Other students, including students with disabilities, they may reach these levels, but not as soon and not as frequently as gifted, talented students. Now, many educators will think of gifted and talented students not as examples of students with disabilities, but as examples of diversity. And as such, they are not so much the responsibility of special ed specialists as the responsibility of all teachers to differentiate their instruction. Supporting students who are gifted and talented is part of the joy of being a teacher. Supporting the gifted and talented usually involves a mixture of acceleration and enrichment of the usual curriculum. Acceleration involves either a child skipping a grade or else the teachers redesigning the curriculum within a particular grade or classroom so that more material is covered faster. Either strategy works, but only up to a point. Children who have skipped a grade usually function well in the higher grade, both academically and socially. Unfortunately, skipping grades cannot happen repeatedly unless teachers, parents, and the students themselves are prepared to live with large age and maturity differences within single classrooms. In itself, too, there is no guarantee that instruction in the new higher grade classroom will be any more stimulating than it was in the former lower grade classroom. Redesigning the curriculum is also beneficial to the student, but it's impractical to do so on a widespread basis. Even if teachers had the time to redesign their programs, many non-gifted students would be left behind as a result. It's a challenge. Enrichment it involves providing additional or different instruction added on to the usual curriculum, the curriculum goals and activities. Instead of books at more advanced reading levels, for example, a student might read a wider variety, a wider type of literature at the student's current reading level, or try writing additional types of literature themselves. Instead of moving ahead to more difficult kinds of math programs, the student might work on unusual logic programs not assigned to the rest of the class. Like acceleration, enrichment works well up to a point. Enrichment curricula exists to help classroom teachers working with gifted students. And it saves the teacher the time and work of creating enrichment materials themselves. Since enrichment is not part of the normal officially sanctioned curriculum, however, there's a risk that it will be perceived as busy work rather than as intellectual stimulation and growth, particularly if the teacher themselves are not familiar with the enrichment material or is otherwise unable to involve themselves in the material fully. Like I say, gifted, talented students take time and energy. Now, obviously, acceleration and enrichment can sometimes be combined. A student can skip a grade and also be introduced to interesting extra material at the new grade level. A teacher can move a student to the next unit of study faster than she moves the rest of the class, while at the same time offering additional activities not related to the unit of study directly. For a teacher with a student who is gifted or talented, however, the real challenge is not simply to choose between acceleration and enrichment, but to observe the student, get to know the student as a unique individual, and offer activities and supports based on that knowledge. That is the essential challenge of differentiating instruction, something needed not just by the gifted and talented, but by students of all sorts. We need to know our students. So differentiating instruction poses challenges about managing instruction. And then, of course, there are other differences within the classroom. For example, gender roles are the patterns, the attitudes, and expectations associated with a particular gender, with being either male or female. Now, for clarity, psychologists sometimes distinguish gender differences, which are related to social roles, from sex differences, which are related only to physiology and anatomy. So using this term gender matters in teaching more than sex, in spite of how people might joke about it. Although there are many exceptions, boys and girls do differ on average in ways that parallel conventional gender stereotypes, and that affects how they behave in school and in class. The differences have to do with physical behaviors, styles of social interaction, academic motivations, behaviors, and choices. They have a variety of sources: their primary parents, their peers, their media. Teachers are certainly not the primary cause of gender role differences, but sometimes teachers influence them by their responses to and choices made on behalf of students. So we need to be mindful of that. Let's look, for example, at physical differences in gender roles. Physically, boys tend to be more active than girls, and by the same token, more restless if they have to sit for long periods of time. They are also more prone than girls to rely on physical aggression if they are frustrated. Both tendencies are inconsistent with the usual demands of classroom life, of course, and make it a little more likely that school will be a difficult experience for boys, even for boys who never actually get in trouble for being restless or aggressive. During the first 2 or 3 years, for example, of elementary school, gross motor skills develop at almost the same age rate for boys and girls. Now, as a group, both sexes can run, they can jump, they can throw a ball, and they're about equal at ease with all of these. Now, we always need to keep in mind that there's a wide difference among individuals of both the sexes. Now, toward the end of elementary school, however, boys pull ahead of girls at these skills, even though neither sex has begun yet to experience puberty. The most likely reason is that boys participate more actively in formal and informal sports because of expectations and support from parents, peers, and society. Now, puberty eventually adds up to this advantage by making boys taller and stronger than girls on average, and therefore more suited, at least in some cases, for sports that rely on height and strength. In thinking about these differences, I want you to keep in mind that they refer to average trends. and that there are numerous individual exceptions to this, and you always need to keep that in mind. Every teacher knows of the individual boys who are not athletic, for example, or of particular girls who are especially restless in class. The individual differences mean, among other things, that it's hard to justify providing different levels of support of resources to boys than to girls for sports or athletics or physical education. The differences also suggest, though, that individual students who contradict gender stereotypes about physical abilities may benefit from emotional support or affirmation from teachers, simply because they may be less likely than usual to get such affirmation from elsewhere. And then there's social differences in gender roles. When relaxing socially, boys more often gravitate to large groups. Whether on the playground or in school hallways or on the street, boys' social groups tend literally to fill up a lot of space. And they often include significant amount of roughhousing, of semi-organized competitive games or sports. Girls, for their part, are more likely to seek and maintain one or two close friends to share more intimate information and feelings with their individuals. To the extent that these gender differences occur, they can make girls less visible or noticeable than boys within the school, at least during the leisure play situations where children or youth choose their companions freely. Now, as with physical differences, however, keep in mind that differences in social interaction do not occur uniformly for all boys and girls. There are boys with close friends, contradicting the general trend, and girls who play primarily in large groups. Differences in social interaction styles happen in the classroom as well. Boys, on average, are more likely to speak up during a class discussion, sometimes even if not called on, or even if they don't know as much about the topic as others in the class. When working on a project in a small co-ed group, furthermore, they have a tendency to ignore a girl's comments and contributions to the group. In this respect, co-ed groups parallel interaction patterns in many parts of society, where men also have a tendency to ignore women's comments and contributions. Something to keep in mind. Then there are academic and cognitive differences in gender. On average, girls are more motivated than boys to perform well in school, at least during elementary school. By the time girls reach high school, however, some may try to downplay their own academic ability in order to make themselves more likable to both sexes. Now, even if this occurs, though, it does not affect their grades. From kindergarten through to 12th grade, girls earn slightly higher average grades than boys. And this fact does not lead to similar achievement, however, because as youngsters move into high school, they tend to choose courses or subjects conventionally associated with their gender. Math and science for boys in particular, and literature and arts for girls. By the end of high school, these differences in course selection makes a measurable difference in boys' and girls' academic performance in these subjects. But again, consider my caution about stereotyping. There are individuals of both sexes whose behaviors and choices run counter to the group trends. It's important to know your students, to be mindful of your students. Another thing that's different is attention paid. In general, teachers interact with boys more often than with girls by a margin of 10 to 30%, depending upon the grade levels of the students and the personality of the teacher. One major reason for the difference is related to the greater assertiveness of boys, and that boys tend to speak up more frequently than girls. So sometimes teachers are simply forced to pay more attention to them. Another possibility that has been raised is that some teachers feel that boys are especially prone to getting into mischief, so they may interact with them more frequently to keep them focused on the task at hand. Still, another possibility is that boys, compared to girls, may interact in a wider variety of styles and situations, that they may simply be that there may be simply richer opportunities to interact with them. So there's lots of possibilities out there. Then there's the idea of public versus private talk and the differences there. Teachers have a tendency to talk to boys from a greater physical distance than they talk to girls. The difference may be both a cause and an effect of general gender expectations. Expressive nurturing is expected more often of girls and women, and a business-like task orientation is expected more often of boys and men, particularly in mixed-sex groups. Now, whatever the reason, the effect is to give interactions with boys more publicity. When two people converse with each other from across the classroom, many others can overhear them. When they are at each other's elbows, though, few others can hear. And so there's a difference that takes place there. And then there's the differences in the ways that teachers express praise or criticism. In spite of our desire to be fair with students, there is a tendency among teachers to distribute praise and criticism differently to boys and girls. The differences are that the tendency is to praise boys more than girls for displaying knowledge correctly, but to criticize girls more than boys for displaying knowledge incorrectly. Another way of saying this difference is by what teachers tend to overlook. With boys, they tend to overlook wrong answers, but with girls, they tend to overlook right answers. And the result is an unintended tendency to make boys' knowledge seem more important and boys themselves more competent. The second result is the other side of the coin, a tendency to make girls' knowledge less visible and girls themselves seem less competent. And that is unfortunate, and that's something that we always need to be mindful of as we consider all of these things. So gender differences will also occur in the realm of classroom behavior. Teachers tend to praise girls for good behavior, regardless of its relevance to content or the lesson at hand. And they tend to criticize boys for bad or inappropriate behavior. And this difference can also be stated in terms of what teachers overlook. With girls, they tend to overlook behavior that is not appropriate. But with boys, they tend to overlook behavior that is appropriate. The net result in this case is to make girls seem more good than they really may be, and also make their goodness seem more important than their academic competence. By the same token, teachers' patterns of response imply that boys are more bad than they really need to be. Now, at first glance, the gender differences in interaction can seem scary or discouraging and really critical of teachers because they imply that teachers as a group are biased about gender. But this conclusion is really too simplistic, and for a couple of reasons. One is that, like all differences between groups, interaction patterns and trends, and as such, they hide a lot of variation within them. The other is that the trends suggest what often tends, in fact, to happen, not what, in fact, happens if a teacher consciously sets about to avoid interaction patterns like the one I just talked about. Fortunately for all of us, teaching does not need to be unthinking. We have choices that we can make and even be reflective within a busy classroom. And so as you go through your teacher education, you will learn skills of reflecting upon your teaching, and in your professional practice, you will learn these again and again. And as we go along, we will become more and more fair in our teaching. And I just want you to be mindful of that. That the tendencies do not have to dictate what actually happens. Now I want to talk a little bit about cultural background and a little bit about how there can be different ways of defining cultural background. Now, in some cases, dominant cultural attitudes can oppress or alienate particular students to the point where they feel like they have no choice but to put themselves in the margins of the mainstream activities. Such students may develop an oppositional cultural identity, meaning that they define themselves not by who they are, but by how they differ from or oppose mainstream culture. It's kind of like a Canadian, how a Canadian defines himself as not American to some extent. Instead of aspiring to do well in school, for example, or to get along with teachers, sometimes students suffering with oppositional cultural identity may aspire not to do well and not to be liked by teachers. Now, obviously, this sort of attitude poses problems for teachers who try to motivate their students, and also poses problems for the students' long-term success in life. Oppositional identity is especially likely in what is sometimes called involuntary minorities, groups that have immigrated or joined society against their will, and who may have been given few resources with which to participate in society. Now, within Canada, it's fairly easy. The Indigenous communities are certainly people that fit into that. They have not been given a fair share throughout history. And so it's very easy to fall into that pattern. And so we need to take extra care to meet these students individually, to hear their needs and to help them to feel the desire to be motivated. Now, as cultural groups, their experiences can be quite different from what is sometimes called voluntary minorities, groups that choose to immigrate to a society in order to create better lives for themselves. The one group is more likely to work actively to fit into their newfound culture, whereas the involuntary minorities feel powerless. So learning to fit into a new culture is a challenging task in itself. But on a whole, it's an easier task for teachers to work with the individual to, once you understand that identity, to be able to work with it, to bring out motivations. Now, part of that is that it's important to accommodate cultural diversity in practice. Accommodating cultural diversity involves more than adding cultural content to your curriculum, more than celebrating different holidays or focusing on different topics within social studies, for example. There are useful activities in doing those things, but they are only the starting point for a truly multicultural education. In addition, it's important to engage students in exploring the culturally based assumptions of whatever subject that you're studying, in whatever topic you're looking at, and exploring the cultural history behind it, because that is important for helping people to understand the different biases that sometimes get tied into different institutional structures. So integrating cultural content into the curriculum is essential wherever possible. It's important to stimulate knowledge construction to help students understand cultural assumptions. It's important to have flexible teaching strategies that give all students access and success with learning. If some students prefer to learn cooperatively rather than independently, for example, then students should make provision for some cooperative learning activities. There should be a deliberate attempt for reducing prejudice among students. And this could and should happen even in classes that don't seem to have cultural diversity on the face of them. Such classes always have diversity, even if it's not a visible, immediate diversity. Students and families will vary in their financial circumstances. Students will vary in their gender preferences, and students will vary in their attitudes about religion, politics, and so on. And it's also important to encourage the entire school to be aware of diversity in all its aspects. To look at what's the racial composition of the school staff, of what are the attitudes of the school staff? What are the policies that favor particular students unfairly? All of these strategies are important to allow for flexible strategies within teaching, to allow for allowing individuals to grow and to succeed and to be accepted within this learning community, because that's absolutely important. So, in summary, students differ in a multitude of ways, both individually and as groups. Individually, students have preferred learning styles as well as preferred cognitive or thinking styles. They also have unique profiles or intelligence or competence that affect how and what they learn most successfully. In addition to individual diversity, students tend to differ according to their gender, although there are numerous individual exceptions to this, but there's differences generally in motor abilities, motivation, experience in athletics, and these tend to change throughout the elementary and high school years. Socially, boys tend to adopt relationships that are more active and wide-ranging than do girls. Academically, girls tend to be a bit more motivated to receive slightly higher marks in school. Teachers sometimes contribute to gender role differences, perhaps without tending to, by paying attention to boys more frequently and more publicly in class, and by distributing praise and criticism in different ways across the sexes. Students also differ according to cultures, language, and ethnic groups of their families. Many students are bilingual. What's the educational consequences of this? What are the opportunities here? All of these things play into it. And so there needs to be a recognition for diversity within the classroom, within the teachers, within the school, within the students, within the community. Diversity is always going to be there, and we need to draw upon the richness of that diversity. And that diversity then becomes part of the joy of teaching. Yes, it can require a little bit more effort, but it's that extra effort of discovering that diversity and bringing freedom within the classroom that makes teaching so enjoyable and makes the classroom such a rich learning environment for the students. That's it for our class today. See you next week.